This is the second in what I hope will be a handful of videos covering the experiences that spurred me to question my religion and later to identify as an atheist. I'm hoping that reviewing my experiences will help to refine my thinking and create a record that I can look at later. I also want to create this video for family and friends who find out that I'm an atheist. In-person conversations have sometimes been frustrating. So I'm going to try using a video recording as an easy way to communicate the major experiences that led to my non-belief. And since no one wants to hear me talk nonstop for an hour, I've split these recordings into more manageable 10 to 15 minute segments. If I've linked you to this series, I hope that this will provide some context for why I identify as an atheist. Okay, let's jump into it. After my initial experiences, my faith crumbled gradually. At least at first, I still believed in Christianity. I told myself that the doctrines were true, that faith could still work, and that I shouldn't toss out the baby with the bathwater. I thought that I simply and my faith. However, without the prior surety that my religious faith had provided, that its doctrines were true, some of the doctrines that I examined seemed wrong on many levels. I struggled with the doctrine of hell in particular. The idea that God casts out, exiles, or tortures non-believers for eternity gnawed at me. How could a just God cast away so much of humanity? And yet I yearned to retain my beliefs and was terrified of letting it go. I'd circled back around to try to reaffirm that my faith was true. And it was, to use the term, a hellish mental merry-go-round, because even the doctrine of hell terrified me. And underlying my questions, I also worried that by questioning, I was consigning myself to hell. In short, I locked myself for months in a cognitive trap. I couldn't find a way to reconcile the doctrine of hell on an intellectual level, but I couldn't just walk away from the doctrine on an emotional level either. After hitting a wall, I asked my bishop and some other friends from church about how they reconciled the concept of hell with justice. And I used one of my friends in high school as a tangible example, because I knew she was a devout Jew and completely uninterested in converting to any form of Christianity. My bishop stated something along the lines that God works in mysterious ways. He confidently asserted that my non-believing friends would eventually, quote, find the truth, unquote, and so therefore wouldn't end up in hell. One of my friends used the language of justice and punishment. He skirted around the specific example of my Jewish friend. Instead, he spoke more generally that it was my friend and everyone like her who could choose heaven or hell simply by accepting the truer faith, and that being cast out of heaven and hell and into hell was the just punishment for rejecting Christ. Of course, this response didn't even recognize my question. It assumed justice is the sine qua non of the doctrine of hell. He even seemed to celebrate the eternal punishment of non-believers in hell. And that stung. Why celebrate eternal hellfire for a friend of mine from high school simply because her belief in another religion? While I struggled with the doctrine of hell, the cracks in my belief system eroded away my confidence in my faith. The whole world felt fragile and uncertain, like I'd suddenly found myself unexpectedly extending a foot into the air above a precipice. Maybe because of the cognitive load, I acted pretty recklessly. One time, I almost wrecked my bike and myself because instead of dismounting, I decided to ride it down a stone and concrete staircase. For months, I tossed around the doctrine of hell in my mind. One day, though, I woke up. I looked in the mirror, breathed in deep, and stopped the whirling racket in my mind. And a single thought rose to the surface. If I was doomed to hell, then so be it. I would accept hell. I could at least know that I had tried my best, and that was enough. And from that moment, the fear and the turmoil and the anxiety faded away. I realized I didn't need to justify hell on an intellectual level, and I didn't need to fear it on an emotional level. I'm not sure I recommend such an approach for anyone else struggling with a crippling fear, but for me it worked. And let me just say here and now, hell is not justice. Hell is an ugly little bit of emotional blackmail deeply embedded into the foundational doctrines of many forms of Christianity. It's a mockery of justice in our society. First, justice and torture are incompatible. Torture, by definition, violates the modern conception of justice because it inflicts unnecessary suffering and degrades human dignity. Torture is specific, and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Any God who actively or passively allows torture and eternal damnation against vast swaths of humanity is not worthy of worship. Second, even imagining and justifying the use of torture against others is dehumanizing. I don't think it is possible to justify such a position without stripping away at least a part of another person's humanity. And it isn't simply chance that hellfire and damnation figure so prominently in the language of religious extremism. It's an easy tool for extremists to use to build social group cohesion and to attack their perceived enemies. It's destructive for our wider and more diverse society to have such a ready-made religious doctrine to facilitate this division. Finally, hell inherently violates proportionality. In the justice system, our society has determined that the punishment for any crime should be roughly proportional to the severity of the crime. Now, this does vary widely, but proportionality in general is an accepted principle of our justice system. A minor crime, for instance, shoplifting maybe, might not even require a prison sentence. Maybe a person can instead pay a fine, attend a class, or do community service. Hell, by the most common doctrinal definition, is an eternal punishment for actions in a person's finite life. It is laughable to call infinite punishment for any finite crime any type of justice, even by fallible human standards. Now, I know many believing Christians are uncomfortable with the philosophical or ethical implications of hell. Most mainline Christian denominations have worked hard to downplay hell as a doctrine within Christianity. I have even heard something along the lines that, quote, hell exists, but I don't think anyone ends up there, end quote. This rational thinking sands away the hard edges of the doctrine of hell, which is a good thing to my mind. But I cannot accept even this more benign conception of hell. The emotional blackmail is still present, and it still violates my more modern conception of justice. Let me use an analogy of a God as a father figure. It's a common enough conceit within Christianity. Let's say that I have a child in my care, and I want the child to behave in a certain way. Things like eat their vegetables, or don't draw on the wall with crayon. But rather than act like a sensible human being, I build a torture rack in the living room. I tell the child, if you don't obey me, I'll string you up on that rack as punishment. Even if I never use the rack, it is still child abuse. It is still abusive. It wouldn't be okay for me to do that to a child, and I cannot believe in a God who would act in a similar manner. In short, I consider the doctrine of hell a stain on most of Christianity. It is a doctrine that has no redeeming features. It's a mechanism of control and manipulation. It's used to convert non-believers to Christianity, and the more extreme Christians even use hell as a threat against perceived opponents and non-believers. Even the softer forms of the doctrine, in my perspective, contain a seed of injustice. Now, Christianity can encourage strong community bonds or public service or provide social support to a person. And I can understand someone who can reconcile themselves to a softer form of the doctrine of hell to maintain social connections. But that doesn't somehow fix the problems inherent in the doctrine of hell.